am a local content creator on YouTube. I mainly discuss video games and other media, and my channel is Entertainment with Fun. So, yep, that's what I'm here. Kind of big video game nerd, so love talking about them, And today we're going to be going over the video game litmus test. What is this about? I want to go over a real quick run about what everything is and what we're going to be going over. So, we are mainly talking about the aspects of a playground-style open-world game, breaking them down into 3 categories. We're going to go over what to implement and what not to implement in these areas, and then ways to test each of these aspects to see if they're enjoyable to play. So, what makes an open world? There's 2 types of open world games. Mainly, a playground and a sandbox open world game. What makes these tick? Really, what are the 2 different styles? What are they? So, a playground open world game is all about exploration, navigation, interaction. It's a set built open world that you, as the player, are going to go explore. This is games like Breath of the Wild and Red Dead Redemption 2. Now there's the other option, which is sandbox games. These are all about building, shaping the world, gathering resources to build and shape said world. These are games like Valheim and most popular, Minecraft. I want to make a clear distinction about what these 2 are, because we are going to be focusing on playground games. So if for some reason you don't see me talking about sandbox games at all, it's because they really are kind of fundamentally different how you build games for them. So that's why I want to make the distinction for you guys. So first, there are 3 major aspects to the playground and open world. Open world level design, how you're going to create the world, how you're going to go about it, how you're going to get the player to really interact with it and move from place to place. Movement, how the player is literally going to move through the world, how they're going to enjoy moving through, how is that going to be entertaining, how's it going to be fun for them. And then last is immersion. How much does the player feel like they're part of the world and not playing a video game? That, I think everybody likes to be immersed. It's very important for open world games especially. So, part 1, open world level design. How to put together your open world. First is you're going to use set pieces to bring the player into the map. So here I use the Royal Capital from Elden Ring. The elevator that goes up, you get to this point, you go up the elevator, and then you're going to have the players explore set area within the set piece, which essentially is just once the players see the set piece, they get somewhere and they get to explore it and have fun and discover things and all like that. And then from their discovering, you reward the player with new interactions and surprises and rewards. So, set pieces. Why are set pieces so useful? They're a really great way of getting the player to go places and want to things. The first main reason why it's useful is call to action. This is usually in most open world games, you'll have a point where your player comes into the open world. And what you want to do is you want to have some sort of set piece that is going to call them to explore the open world. Again, using Elden Ring as an example, probably going to be the primary example for this section. You have Stormdale Castle right here in the background. When you come out of the crypt, I think it is, and you come out to the open world, the first thing that your eyes are going to notice is that huge castle in the background. And it's immediately going to make the player go, I want to go there. I want to see what's there. I want to go explore it. Second reason is directional awareness. You really want the player to know where they are, have a rough estimate of where they are at all times without constantly having to open the map, constantly having to, figure out exactly their pinpoint location. If you give the player big set pieces that they're going to know where they are, Death Mountain, for instance, is great from Breath of the Wild. It's always in the top, roughly kind of right of the map. So if you see Death Mountain and you're near it, you kind of know where you are in the map and location. You don't have to constantly take the player out of the experience. Third is leaving the player in the loop with the story. You want to have your set pieces also kind of integrate story modes, because then you have a great way for the player to just naturally come across story and never be left out of the experience, feel like something's going on. Whiterun is a great example of this from Skyrim, because it's literally the first place that you learn about being a dragonborn, first place you fight a dragon, all that stuff, and it really is the first major set piece the game lets you look at and go and explore, or go experience. So it's a really cool way to also integrate story and make sure the character stays on path and experiences the pieces of the story you want them to experience. And then last is carrot on the stick, incentivizing players to come back. So What these are things that you're going to essentially lock the player out from initially. So like again, from Elden Ring, this elevator that you use to get to the royal capital, valley, and all that stuff, you actually need 2 pieces of a medallion to even go up this elevator. So it's a really good way to make the player keep things in their mind and keep them coming back to different areas, because this is a really cool set piece, right? It's this giant elevator with statues and all that stuff, and the player is going to want to naturally explore that and go from there. And if they see that it's locked out, they're going to keep that in their mind and want to come back to it. So it's a great way to keep your player, aware of all the different set pieces and places they can go. Exploring areas is the second part of making a good open world. So you're going to use a primary path player walking. I wanted to bring this up again. Royal Capital from Elden Ring. If you notice here, there is a path the player walks on all the way around. They can go around. But the cool part about this is, sure, there's a couple pieces here and here, but the main thing you want to do is you want to have areas of interest not on the path. And the reason why is so the player feels like they are making their own journey through the world. If you have these different set pieces and all these little exploring things that you can find through the world, but aren't directly on the path that the player is walking on, it makes them kind of create their own path and feel like they are actually making their journey and making their experience go through the game. So it feels a lot more rewarding to the player. Speaking of rewarding, yes, you had a question?
What were the 3 aspects again? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Sorry, it is set pieces, exploration, and going through and exploring, and then rewards.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So the first rewards are low tier rewards. These are things you're going to find in let's say your player stumbles upon a little shack in your open world. These are going to be things like common weapons, common armor, maybe a lore book or a lore note, and health items and things like that. They're going to be things that your player is going to want to have and have in abundance, but they're not going to be necessarily really gratifying in the long term. Second tier rewards are things like upgrades, unique armor and weapons, and unique mounts and horses and things like that. These will give the character a little bit more incentivization and be like, oh cool, I actually did get something really nice out of this. And then the last is high tier. These are unique quests, unique missions, dungeons, and bosses. Typically, what you want to do is the bigger the discovery, the bigger the reward you want to have, right? So if your player discovers a castle, it would be really unfulfilling if all they got out of the castle was a health potion and a couple of weapons, right? So you really want to make that castle have a dungeon, a quest, a boss, something that really is going to make them feel like, oh wow, I found this place and this is worth going through because it's a big discovery. So you want to, the tier isn't necessarily in terms of game tier loot, it's more about how much it's going to reward the player for the discovery. So, how to tell if your open world level design is working? Can you tell where you are without a map? Really simply, can you have a rough idea of where your player is, where they're going, what they're doing, constantly keeping them in some sort of knowledgeable sense of where they are in the world. Next is when a new place is discovered, is there excitement? If your player is constantly discovering new places, new things, and they're not really feeling that level of excitement of finding a new place, and they're like, oh great, another place, then your reward incentive is probably off, and it means your character doesn't feel, your player, sorry, doesn't feel like it is worth going and finding new things. Last is how often is the player leading the charge? How often is the game leading the player or the player making their own experience? If a player is just looking in their menu for quests, going straight to quests, doing things like that, that probably means the open world level design is in some sense flawed, because you want to give that player that sense of exploration, give them that sense of, I want to go look out into the world, not the world has to help me, if that makes sense. So part 2, movement. Most important rule with movement, without a doubt. Make moving through your world entertaining. I could not tell you how many times I've played an open world game and halfway through playing it, I just get exhausted because of the fact that I'm not doing anything fun. I'm not doing any kind of constant enjoyment through the moving the world. I'm just going through the motions, right? And there's really 2 main ways you can do this. The first is variety. Ubisoft games do this a lot. Far Cry, I'm going to use as a primary example here. And second is challenge-based movement. Breath of the Wild does this best. So variety Far Cry 5 has the movement variety, and it's really simple, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but it is important to know what it is. It's essentially just giving your player a lot of access to a lot of different ways of getting through your world that are all pretty accessible. So wherever your player is in the world, they're getting some sort of unique experience and also going through the world. A lot of games do this, and it's really the easiest way to make the player feel like they're having fun moving through the world without having to put too much, intensive work into it. The second is challenge. This is a little bit more intensive, so we're gonna take it in a couple of steps. Challenge movement is essentially rewarding and incentivizing the player for more complex levels of movement and making them feel like they are learning skills, so it feels more fulfilling to go through the world because they're learning more adaptive movements. So you have your low challenge movements in Breath of the Wild. You have your running, your sprinting, your fast travel. These are things that are done with a button or an analog stick, tilt, something like that. It's really just something that is going to make your player go through the world really easy with no friction and no worries of consequences. Second are medium challenge movements. These are movements that are going to be a little bit more sophisticated, but not necessarily super difficult for the player, but it is adding extra level of thought to the players to keep thought of. Think about climbing and gliding in Breath of the Wild. A great example of this is just you have to gauge how far you're going to be climbing up, how far you're going to be gliding. You don't want to run out of stamina while climbing, fall off the cliff, die. You don't want to, misgauge your jump while you're paragliding and miss the ledge you're trying to get on and land way lower than you want to. Horse is the same way. In a sense, you want to make sure the horse is happy. You want to make sure you're not overusing your sprint ability on the horse. You want to make sure it's not getting scared, things like that. So it's introducing a couple of ideas to the player to make them really think about where they're moving and rewarding them for, putting thought into that kind of movement. Last is high challenge movement. I mean, shield surfing is ridiculous, but it's great at the same time, right? Because there's this really cool incentive of learning to get good with shield surfing. You have to make sure you're not hitting certain rocks, things like that. And there's a really high, what is the consequence if you don't do it? You'll break your shield and you'll go tumbling down the mountain. You'll take a lot of damage and get really hurt. And then the other way is moving through the weather in Breath of the Wild. Weather in the game is pretty deadly, especially if you have metal on, you're gonna get hit by lightning and you're gonna take a lot of damage. But if you learn how to take the metal off, for instance, or learn to go undercover, things like that, you really get rewarded for learning how to move through the rain. Same with climbing in weather. If you actually time it right, you won't slip on the rocks when you do a jump while climbing. So the player feels very rewarded in this sense because they're able to learn how to climb through the weather. So the challenge movement set is really interesting and fun, but it is very hard to implement, but that is really the two main ways to do it. Yes, sir?
This challenge movement, does every game that utilize the challenge movement utilize each level, or do you feel like there are games that just stick with one level?
There are some games, technically all games will have challenge level movement, right? So if we want to use Far Cry as an example, it does have challenge level movement, but it's all low challenge movement, right? It's just a wide variety.
Because I think the Spider-Man too, where it's like, you kind of have challenge movement, but it feels like it's mostly mid to high level.
Exactly.
Okay.
Connor?
Is another way for challenge movement also just like a skill gap or a skill level? Like a new player probably won't be able to use the shield as effectively as a player who's maybe learned some skills after a few hours.
Yes, it's also a skill. Challenge and skill can be interchangeable here. I think mastering the challenge is just what I would refer to terminology. All right, so how to test movement. First, and this is the easiest and most straightforward, you create test maps for your movement. You have a bunch of geometry in there that works for different types of movement, so you can just have a bunch of different ones you can test in there. This really helps because it shows how rewarding the movement is, it shows how it feels, how it works in an isolated environment. Really a lot of things in test maps for movements is going to be a lot more isolated stuff. You can kind of have them built to play off of each other in test maps, so you can have a really high point, if we're going with the Breath of the Wild analogy, you can have a really high point of geometry that also lands to a climbing point of geometry, and you can see how it feels to jump and then land on the climbing point. The third point is the best way to make sure things are working. It's just a way to isolate all the different types of movement and make sure none of them feel janky or working in a specific way, things like that. The second primary way is disable fast travel, or prevent yourself from using fast travel. why this will help is a big one is how engaging the movement is. Does the player feel bored without fast traveling? Because if that's the case, then your movement's not fun. It's just that simple. And that sucks, but you'd have to go back to the drawing board and see why your movement isn't fun and why it isn't being engaging. Second is working in real environments. Again, I'll use climbing with Link as an example. You know, you may have tested 75-degree climbing angles or at 5-degree increments, but you didn't check 72 degrees. So Link's now climbing up at a 72-degree rock in your real world, falls through the map, and now it's just infinitely falling. It's a great way to see how all your movement mechanics are working in the real environment. And lastly, is to see how reliable your movement is. It's to see what types of movements the players are and aren't using. So I use Far Cry as an example. Let's say you're going from point A to point B, and there's a car, motorcycle, and a car. And every time your player goes, they're only using the motorcycle. They never get in the car, for some reason. That's probably showing your car's not that interesting, how the car movement is not that fun. How can you spice it? It's just a good way to see that that's an issue. Part 3, immersion. Making the player feel like they're part of the ride. Once you take a second here and look at this, is there anything you notice that's different from the other 2 slides of the parts that I announced? Yes?
New picture?
No, not no picture. So, if no one sees it, that's fine. But the big thing is what I did here is I made the 3 an actual number 3 instead of worded out 3. Now, none of you might have noticed this, but some people would. And that brings me to my first point with immersion, which is having a level of consistency and rationality. If you don't have a level of consistency, it's very easy for the players to be taken out of the game. You know, if something isn't adding up with one way or another, a lot of players can get really taken out. Not everybody feels like this, but it is, for a lot of people, a way to get really taken out of the experience. Second is events that can happen to you while traveling. Give your players something to have happen to them while they're moving, while they're going through the world, because that really helps with making them feel like the world's alive, things are happening, stuff like that. So even if your movement is fun and it is rewarding, you know, having other things happen along the way is useful. Third is keep UI elements to a minimum and diegetic as possible. For anybody who doesn't know the term, just because it is a little bit different and not commonly talked about all the time, diegetic is where you make things feel like they're part of the game. It's really just a way to make it feel like part of the real world. So how are you going to test? Or the 3 examples of how to go over all this. Consistency and rationality. First is NPC relations to you and others. Fallout New Vegas does this flawlessly, so you know, think about how NPCs react in that game and how they speak to people. You know, the 2 main factions, NCR, New California Republic, and Caesar's Legion. Both of them hate each other. You're never going to see those 2 NPCs from those 2 factions agree with each other and work with each other. Likewise, if there's an NPC that hates that faction, such as like Archimedes from Fallout New Vegas, he's going to hate you if you work with Caesar's Legion, because he hates Caesar's Legion. You want to make a consistent lore for your characters and NPCs to follow, so that it feels really interesting when you come into those interactions with them. Second is traveling and architecture that makes sense of the world. Skyrim, really great about this. You know, it's really cool to walk around Skyrim and see all these paths laid out that are actually like, make sense and that are direct paths to the main cities and things like that. And you can see the signs that lead to different cities and really shows that the world's going on. Same with architecture. You know, there's this really strong Nordic vibe with Skyrim, and it shows really great stuff all the time. But if you notice, all the architecture looks like what it would look like in that area. It's very consistent. None of them ever feel out of place. There's never a point where you look at, you know, a building in Skyrim and you're like, why is that here? Doesn't make sense. And last is explanation for events. The big thing with explanation for events is if you have gameplay elements you want the character to experience, explain them in your world. It's so helpful, even if they're dumb. Like, and that's why I use the Blood Moon example in Breath of the Wild. It is kind of ridiculous, right, in Breath of the Wild that Ganon is so evil that he's able to respawn everything in the world and it comes back. But the fact that they explain that and at least tell that in the world keeps the player a little bit more immersed in the gameplay. It keeps them from being like, oh, this is just a gameplay element, even if it is a little bit, you know, goofy. Yep.
I was going to say for your second point is in terms of architecture that makes sense to you, is there a way for you to balance architecture that doesn't make sense to make it kind of fit into the if that makes sense. I think of like Nier Automata when you go down into Kakuzu, or I don't know.
I have not played Nier Automata, but
Okay.
I can understand what you're saying.
But it's like basically you kind of cut a corner and you're like, oh, this is different than everything else that I've seen.
Yeah,
so
of
far.
course. You can definitely do that. Juxtaposition is always really fun in open worlds. You just want to make sure you're doing it in a tasteful way and not just like it's laid out of nowhere, like you just said. Yeah, like you just said, there's a point, I'm guessing how it works is you make a turn or you go through a path or something like that, and then it's a different place. It's not just, oh hey,
Like
this
it's
building.
consistent, and then it's just
Exactly.
out of place. Okay. Makes
Exactly.
sense.
You just want to lead the player into the experience.
Okay.
Breath of the Wild actually does something like that, where you run into some Zonai ruins, and it's the architecture like completely different from anything else in the game, and they don't really explain it other than this is some old culture that's been forgotten in history, and then they pay it off in the scene.
Nice. Okay. That makes sense. So basically, making sure it kind of connects in some
Yeah.
way that it.
Okay, exactly. And then last is event, or not last, but second is events while on the move. Path events are really easy examples. Breath of the Wild has the Yaga clan, which, let's be honest, the Yaga clan, again, ridiculous but great. They say some weird stuff, and then they're just like, all right, now I'm gonna cook. And it's fun. It's fun to experience that and see that happen. And then second is a lot of the events in Red Dead Redemption, most infamously the snake bite. You know, you find this guy who's got a snake bite, and you get to choose whether or not you suck the venom out and stuff like that. It's just a really easy way to put the player while they're moving, especially on the direct path, and give them a little bit of immersion, feel like there's people in the world, things are going on, stuff like that. Second is adapting to weather conditions. I always love this in games, and I think it's always a great way for immersion. I love the fact that if you're not prepared for it in Breath of the Wild and you get close to Death Mountain, you literally catch on fire. You just do. And it's just like, you gotta learn to deal with that, and you gotta learn to get the right peppers for it, or go and rush and get the Goron armor, or whatever you want to do. But giving the player a chance to deal with that. And then in Red Dead Redemption, it has the same heat and cold mechanic as Breath of the Wild, and you just have to suit up with better, coats, things like that. Adapting to weather conditions is really fun. And these are just two examples. There's plenty of other events on the move. I just wanted to showcase a couple of them to give you an idea of like just making the player feel a little bit more lived in and giving the player something to do while they're moving through the world. Last is minimal UI elements, which is my favorite, and I think a lot of times a unsung hero in a lot of games. First, main example of minimal UI is diegetic maps. I love diegetic maps. I don't know if anybody else does, but it is really cool when the map or the things you're looking at is the same thing the actual character you're playing as looks at. Like the Sheikah Slate in Breath of the Wild is essentially a Switch. But it is really cool when Link pulls up the Sheikah Slate and a map comes up, because it feels like you and Link are looking at the same thing and trying to figure out where to go together. Same with Fallout. It is so fun seeing all the clicks and knobs and turns with the Pip-Boy, and the main map in there is really cool, and it shows the same green HUD as the Pip-Boy and everything like that. It does a really good job specifically at using a menu and not making it feel like your player is being taken out of experience by looking at a map or looking at a menu. Second is hide the HUD when not needed. Both Sea of Thieves and Elden Ring do this really well. I love it when you're not in combat, that these games really just kind of let you take in all the scenery, take in everything, take away all the UI elements, and just go around for a little bit experiencing that world. And then when combat comes back, all the UI and all that stuff can come back. But if you take that stuff out, so then you can really let the character take in everything they're experiencing and seeing. And then last is in-game navigation. So Sea of Thieves again, and Ghost of Tsushima for these two. And Sea of Thieves, when you're trying to navigate, best way to sail and best way to go through, you actually have to align the sails themselves with the wind. And there's no pop-up that says you're perfectly aligned with the wind now. No, the sails get full-blown air through them, and you just move faster. It's a really cool way for the game to show you are moving faster without a pop-up or something to be set. Same with Ghost of Tsushima. You have something very similar where instead of having a point on the map of where you're going, or on your screen, like a marker of your quest marker, you can hit a button and it'll push the wind, and the wind will blow in the direction of where your character needs to go. And it's a really cool way of just showing where the character needs to go and where you the player want to go, without having to, again, have a big map marker or icon on the screen. How to gauge levels of immersion. How often are players reminded that your game is a game? honestly, if your player is constantly just thinking about, this is a video game, it's not necessarily fun in an open world. You want them to be immersed and think about in terms of the world. Speaking of in terms of the world, you want your player to be invested in the world and in the stakes. A really great way to do this is just, have the NPCs be compelling, have your choices matter, things like that. Well, not easy, but those are common ways it happens. If your player is constantly thinking, like, how am I going to level up next? And when am I going to get the next best gear? When am I going to, get the next upgrade, things like that. That means they're probably not really thinking about the world and they're not really being immersed. They're probably more focused on the gameplay elements. And the last is, how often are menu and screens being pulled up in the game being paused? Essentially, how much are you stopping the player, from moving in the world and really continuing their experience? If you have the player constantly pulling up menus and constantly stopping all the time, there's a chance you're just going to kind of get deflated by that and lose kind of the experience. So you want to try to make as many things as possible seamless and fit in with the world.
Would the kind of same will apply if you have like a navigation button, like Dead Space, for example, where you're not really pulling up the map, but you might be hitting that button constantly and not thinking about where you're going.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Yeah, you want to make it so where navigation feels kind of fluid through the game, or if you are going to have constant navigation, like in Dead Space or again in Ghost of Tsushima, the way they do it feels kind of natural to the world. Like the fact that like a map marker literally comes out of Isaac in Dead Space and you see the point where you're supposed to go, it feels more ingrained into the game instead of just getting some sort of marker point.
Shadow of the Colossus does that also.
Shadow of the Colossus? Oh yeah, of course. Oh man, one of my favorite games. I love that game. Problem is that game does so many things unconventional in terms of open world design that. So yeah, that's my wrap up. Following these steps and guidelines can help make a better open world. This is just my opinion as someone who really loves games and really loves playing open world games, so don't take any of these to heart and try to incorporate what works best for your setting and world. Not everything is going to go one-to-one, but I think a lot of these are core foundations you can use in an open world game to make them really good. So at that point, I have finished talking. That's my end of my thing. So any questions? Anybody want to talk about anything? Yes, sir.
Yeah. What about, so sometimes I have problems with integration of story elements like with an open world game. So when I'm playing and the story gives you, so you're supposed to, I like exploring and stuff, so, but then the story element comes along and says, there's this immediate sense of urgency that you must do this. And it's like, then there's this intellectually, I don't know, I could just stop and do side quest, blah, or do these things, but it's like, it's taking me out of it because I don't think I should be doing these things because of this implied urgency.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. And that's actually a great question. So when it comes to emergence and storytelling in open world games, try to avoid it as much as possible because, like, a great example is Fallout 4 and its storytelling. Like, honestly, a dad's not going to stop and go build 5 different settlements, go save a bunch of different people, things like that, before he goes and finds his kid. That does not make sense. So try to avoid stories like that you have. Do things like, again, like what Breath of the Wild does, where you have this concept of like, there's these 4 main things you gotta go get, and then you go fight Ganon. And like, the game doesn't really push you to go do these things immediately, it's just go find them, right? Go find them, go experience them. And then my answer to, at least in terms of if you wanna have urgency and stuff, make that built into the quest, right? Make that built into whatever you're doing. Like Red Dead Redemption has a really good example of this or Red Dead Redemption 2 has an example of this that frustrates me, which they could have just made a really long quest, but instead of doing that, there's a part where a child character in your group literally gets kidnapped, and then 5 minutes later they end the mission, and then it's like, okay, go do whatever you want, and it's like, you could go spend a week doing whatever you want, and this kid's just kidnapped that everybody cares about. Just make that mission longer. It's really just as simple as, you could use something to give the player a heads up of a longer mission, but really the best thing to do is just make any kind of emergence that's going to happen, start and end in the quest that you're doing. Yes, Kyle?
How do you feel about objectives that kind of are put in your way, like say in like Spider-Man where there's like crime happening on your way to something? How do you feel about if someone can fail those objectives? Like if I ignore that, that has a penalty. They don't really do that
That's a hard one. There is a really, I guess the best way to handle that would be if you want some sort of like, you know, I guess lack of a better word, penalty for them not doing those missions, that's okay. But make it minor, don't make it feel like it's gonna ruin the whole experience. You know, but at the same time, also don't prevent them from being able to do that again. Spider-Man does a great job where it's like, you know, the missions come up, and if you can get them, you can go get them, but if you can't, it's not the end of the world, and they will come back again. But there is this constant like idea of like, you are not taking that mission, you are not going to that call of action. It's not necessarily a penalty, but yeah, I see what you're saying. And I would just say the really easiest way to do that is make it so where, you know, maybe there's a unique dialogue for you not doing something, but don't like completely penalize the character and make them feel really crappy for not doing something that's like a side quest or optional content. Any other questions? Yes, sir?
How far are you into Tears of the Kingdom so far?
I've not played it at all.
Not at all, okay.
And I didn't
This
incorporate
one
it.
ruined my next question, was just gonna be, how do you feel about the, changes they made, to the, structure of your,
From, from what I hear to what I've seen, it's really good. The main reason why I didn't incorporate it into this talk, besides the fact that I didn't play it, was the fact that that game, from what I've seen, really skirts the line between being a playground game and a sandbox game.
Yeah.
There's so much freedom you have in that game, in terms of like accomplishing tasks and going through the world and things like that, that it does feel very sandboxish by nature. So it's not the best example for this talk because of the fact that it's kind of that weird middle ground for it.
It's so easy to get sidetracked.
Yeah.
Between whatever, like, your goal kind of happens. I mean, it took me like 2.5 days, I think, to get to some location, but do it 30 feet, and there would be somebody going, hey, help me put this sign up. It's just things like that would happen.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that getting sidetracked, I'm really loving Tears of the Kingdom. I've been playing it a ton, but I've noticed that the horse specifically is something that coming over from Breath of the Wild works less well in Tears of the Kingdom because there's so many times you get sidetracked with like the core updates, you go over there and you build like a car to take it over there, and then you're far away from your horse, and it doesn't. There's no mechanic to like summon it if you're too far away. And you know the stables are far enough from each other that I find that I'll get my horse and start riding, and then within like 5 minutes I've already abandoned it because I have to go over here and climb up the hill and make it a little higher and stuff.
It's like an issue with the movement mechanic itself because now you're no longer relying on this like trend. It's like a, you know, God of War, the boat is at every shore that you're at, you know, or like
There's a lot of terrain where like the horse just can't go.
yeah, exactly. It's like whereas like you really want if you wanted the horse to be that main movement mechanic, you would have made it so that it was very easily accessible, able to traverse any terrain that you're kind of from.
Yeah, no, it's a great example of like, you know, that's a great example of something like in terms of when I was talking about movement. It's really just looking at all the isolated types of movements and see how much a player uses it. Because yeah, with Tears of the Kingdom and how many ways you move around, there's no point using the horse really.
Yeah.
There's no incentive. So yeah.
And I think they're fine with that because there's so much cool stuff you can do.
Yeah.
Right.
But like if you really wanted the player to use the horse, there's so many areas to do it. Be competitive and be more accessible.
Any other questions?
Are your slides available?
No, I did not make something available for that. I'm very sorry. I can definitely, like, if you're interested in having it, I can definitely get like a link share up and share it to people, you know, do that with the Google Docs or something like that. I'd be more than happy to. Come up and talk to me about it, I can get it sent to you somehow. Yeah, that'd be fine. Yes, sir.
This sort of goes way back to the beginning of the presentation where you're talking about having reasons to go back and visit areas, and but this brings me up to what your opinion is about hinting, because another frustrating thing is, okay, was that thing that I saw earlier window dressing, or was that something I really needed to I should interact with later?
That is a great thing to talk about. I would, ideally, what you'd want to do is you would want to make something that lets the player know for sure this is an interactable object, or something that is going to be something they can get back to. Like in that example that I used in Elden Ring, and going up to the Royal Capitol, you have to go up and touch the elevator option, and it says you don't have, it's like, you know, you need the medallion or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrase.
Yeah.
So like when you touch it, it lets you know that, hey, you You can use this, you just can't use it right now. And you want to do something like that with the world, with anything like that. And like Breath of the Wild again does a really good job of this. If there's anything you can't interact with or something you can't like go to, they make it very obvious that it is not in your playable area. And I think more open world games need to take that sort of approach because, you know, it's very frustrating in an open world game when like, you know, you just get somewhere and it's like, oh, you can't go any further, it's done now. Instead of having some sort of like way of showing that, you know, this is not accessible. Anything else at all? Yes, sir?
I'd like to get your thoughts on like collectibles and or like secrets in open world games and how to do those correctly.
So that is a hard question. And the reason why is because sometimes I'm fine with it and sometimes I absolutely hate it. I think the easiest way to do it, and games like Spider-Man and a couple of other games I played do it really well, make it so where you can show specific collectibles on your map at a specific time. I think that's really the most important if you're going to have a lot of collectibles or a lot of objectives you want to finish. Because nothing is more frustrating and anxiety-inducing to me than opening a map and seeing hundreds of thousands or hundreds and thousands of things on the map, all these different things you got to do. If you're able to like have some sort of way to, you know, filter all of that and be like, okay, like in Spider-Man, there's an example where it's like, oh, I just want to go get all the, I don't know, crimes. I want to go do all the crimes in every area. You can make it and just choose it where it's all just the crime side quest. There you go. That's all you got to do. I think that's the best way to approach it, is make it so where the player can filter through all those collectibles and objectives rather than always having all of them on the map at one time. So I think they can be fun. It's just implementation of making sure the player can, you know, tackle it at a reasonable pace for themselves.
So does that sometimes go hand in hand with them knowing what kind of reward they're going to get by pursuing this? Because like in Spider-Man, you know what token you're going to get, which will help you with upgrading. Whereas like maybe Elden Ring, you don't. Okay. Well.
And the reason why I say that is because like Spider-Man has the hidden camera options and things like that as well, hidden photos. So I think a good way of that, what you're talking about, is balancing act of like have things that players can see and have things that player can't see. And I think that's a really good way of doing it. Any other questions at all? Yes, sir?
You talked about a lot of really good games with good examples you like. But I was curious if you had any open world games you didn't care for it as much and wanted to dish on some games that you thought didn't work in some areas.
That is a very great question. There are some. I think Assassin's Creed games, not in terms of everything open world design, but in terms of collectibles is a great example. They don't really let you kind of, yeah, it's not only is it just the same stuff all the time, but it is also the fact that you don't really have a way of, you know, going through and seeing stuff, at least in the older ones and some of the newer ones. It's very frustrating. Everything feels very same and repetitive. I think the idea, again, is like just have a good variety of missions and a good variety of events. Even Red Dead has some stuff that I don't like. To me, there's really no perfect open world game. All of them do good things and bad things. It's just about like, essentially pick your poison. What can you handle? What can't you handle? Because you know, Breath of the Wild, no one's played Breath of the Wild for the story. That story it's a story. It exists. But you know, it's there for exploring and for the adventure. Where saying the inverse kind of goes for Red Dead Redemption 2, right? The exploration and the incentive to look around and find things in Red Dead isn't the best, but it has a really compelling story and really compelling characters for you to play. So it's, unfortunately, a lot of open world games do a lot of good things and bad things. I mean, even Elden Ring, as much as I talked about it, I think the movement in Elden Ring is very boring. That was actually my big talk, is like, because all you use is torrent and running around. And as soon as you get used to those mechanics, you don't really get to do much else in terms of movement, so it stops really becoming super enjoyable. Yes, sir?
Staying on the topic of one of my favorite games, Red Dead Redemption 2, with that open world, how would you balance, you know how it has alternate endings for things that you do within the game, the story, but it seems like you don't, even to get to those endings, you have to like replay the entire thing, or how would you balance that so the players can get that reward for seeing that alternate ending?
The best way to do it in that sense is, I would say, if you're gonna have have changes in your game, make them a lot more frequent and make them a lot more, continuous through the game. So like I think of something like Fallout New Vegas, for example. It is an open world game, but it has so many different ways you can go through the world and do things that a new playthrough is going to be really interesting. I think the best way to do it would just have more changes within the game so that the player feels more incentivized to go back and play more. If you're going to do something like that, yeah.
Okay.
Of course. Yes.
Would you say that it would be like a cursed mix or like an impossible mix to have a heavy story-based game in an open world versus linear?
Not necessarily. I think it's very challenging. I think the big things you'd have to do is a couple of the things I touched on, which is, make the points of critical time and like big story plots happen all throughout one chunk of a mission or something like that, as well as, maybe make it a very slow boil story, slow burn, and maybe, cut off access to the world at certain points. Like I know there's a lot of games like Grand Theft Auto actually did this really well before they went to 5, and I really liked it, which was certain parts of the maps would be sectioned off. So you would have a little bit more to explore every time you go through more, and most of the missions would be one of those 3 areas that you'd unlock. So it kind of kept the character engaged and played in one area, and that's a really good way to do it as well.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a hard task, but it's not impossible. Anything else? All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming. I will be here for. Oh, yeah. Let me go back to that again. I'm on YouTube. Guys, go. There you go. Entertainment lives on YouTube. There you go. So you can see it nice and big. I haven't made some stuff in a little while, but there's going to be more content coming, and this will be posted online and everything. I'm going to try to start making more talks and everything like that. But yeah, that's where I am if you want to keep track of me and hear what I have to say about stuff.
I like your logo.
Thank you. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love this thing. How do you make your logo? How do you get that?
Illustrator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And yeah, I'm very fine with if anybody wants to have this talk and do that, I'm fine with sharing it and trying to get a link out to you guys.